seen it, for which you're partly responsible. But you very, very clearly in your book describe the intellectual and physical environment of Uch to show these correlationships. And with respect to Arab sources, you give a detailed series of pages on how many of the things which are not in Arab sources and should have been in Arab sources are not in the Chachnama itself. That's my first question. The second part is that I think that there is in your answer a slight evasion of the fact that it's not the ruler only, Nasiruddin Kabacha. Of course, he's being addressed and of course his favor is being sought. But I'd like you to elaborate on this network of administrators that moved from Lahore to Uch, from Uch to Delhi and Badayun and so forth, and how this further expands your theory. It isn't a Niccolo Machiavelli mirror of princes being written only for the ruler. It isn't a Kautilya's Arthashastra being written specifically for a Maurya ruler only. In your book, you are very, very clear about this.
This is giving me flashbacks to my dissertation defense. But he's absolutely right on all of those things. As in, I do try to explain them, and I will try to recap it in a succinct form now. But if the claim is that someone finds a text and that text is then put into Persian, a host of different other issues come up. One of the questions is this idea, which is who should be the ideal reader of this text, right? And so Kabacha is someone that the author explicitly says, like, I'm hoping that this gets his audience, and he's partially successful in it. He gets it to Kabacha's central minister, who is the person that the text is actually dedicated to. But the audience is indeed larger. Juzjani, who's the chief Qadi of Uch and will go on to be the chief historian of Altamash, writing one of the most important history texts called Tabaqat al-Nasiri, and Aufi, who I mentioned a little bit earlier, who is compiling the anthology of all of the major Persian poets of early 13th century. A number of those intellectuals have been attracted to Kabacha's court from various parts of Afghanistan and Iran. After Kabacha's death, a number of them, in fact, all of them, will become important administrators in Delhi and will be the people who make the Delhi Sultanate that we know, especially after the death of Iltutmish, the short period in which Razia Sultan came to power, and then the transfer of power. These intellectuals, they have different kinds of roles to play, but the role that I want us to just sit with for a second is the role of historians. They have other jobs. Someone is a jurist, someone is a qadi, someone else is a master of constabulary. But they are invested in the idea of history writing in order to define the political world in which they are active. And that definition isn't simply how to govern or how to rule, but also how to make a just and ethical society. And the society that they are most invested in is the society of historians. That's their most, because they imagine the historian to be a type of voice, a critical voice that can show the limits of political power, right? And so the reason Chachnama becomes such an important text is precisely that it becomes a way in which the other historical works that are going to be written in the early to mid 13th century and all the way down to Farishta in the early 17th century will say that we are contributing to an ethical project of history writing that we can show a genealogical thought. Now, I don't talk about this in great detail in the Book of Conquest, but this is one of the central questions that I elaborate in The Loss of Hindustan, where Juzjani, who writes Tabaqat al-Nasiri, who's a cohort of Kufi in Uch, Juzjani says, look, my job is to correct the errors of the preceding generation, and my errors have to be corrected by those who come after me. And this comity of historical writing is the only way that we can create a system of equitable, just rule. The problem that I face, or you face, or we all face, is that the colonial state, Eliot, etc., when they encounter these texts, will begin with Muslim historians are biased. Muslim historians are non-objective. The history they write is full of you are the sunshine and the moon and blah 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 blah. Effusive language. Persian is such an imprecise way to express oneself. There are no events, there is no cause and effect. So all of the histories, all of the things that someone like Farishta in the early 17th century is going to rely upon is discarded as full of romance by people like Eliot. And the text that symbolizes that for them, for the colonial state, um, the romantic culpability of Persian histories is Chachna. Things that the colonial state says are just romance. They're just crazy, made up things. And so there is a kind of a double bind in which that theory is no longer read as theory, history is no longer read as history, and a generation upon generation stretching from early 13th century to all the way, again, for my purposes, 17th century, 300 years worth of historical writing, is dismissed as being full of, romantic fables.
One more thing I would like you to elaborate on that, since which I find a little bit contradictory in your. You talk about the origin of Muslims that was before the invasion of the Arabs, and you refer to the Chachnama again, and there is only one conversion mentioned in Chachnama, that one person was converted. I think he was a Syrian. So on the one hand, you mentioned that Chachnama is not reliable, authentic source of history. And on the other hand, you mentioned that without any violence or forced conversion, Islam spread gradually through trade. So I find it a bit contradictory.
Yeah, no, I don't claim that part. What I do say is that Chachnama is used as an example of the conversion by sword by the colonial state. So they say, look, this is a story of conquest. This story of conquest leads to de-Brahmification of Sindh and the expulsion of Buddhists, and the forced conversion becomes the motif. The sword conversion by sword becomes the motif. What I say is that Chachnama actually has no such account in it. So it's more how the colonial state misreads the actual text. And in fact, if you read Chachnama, there's only
misreads or intentionally misreads?
Intentionally misreads, yeah. And in fact, there's only one account that we can even understand as conversion, and even then it's not really conversion, but sure, whatever. But so what happens is that people tend to stick to their, let's say, creedal solidarities in the Chachnama, no matter what their creedal solidarities may be. They don't move across them. And that seems to be an important political aim of the 13th century, that we don't push people here or there. And the proof of this is actually not in Uch or in Kabacha, because neither of them end up as players. The proof of this is actually in Razia Sultan's reign in Delhi, in which the question of conversion and rule by a female sultan are kind of a break from normative thinking. And Juzjani is one of the people who says, actually, there is nothing wrong theologically or historically for a female ruler. And there's nothing wrong with that ruler having no direct creedal affiliation with the troops that they are commanding. So the idea of the ruler and the subject population being of the same exact faith, and I use creedal largely because we are thinking about Muslim as a kind of total category, just as we think about Hindu as a total category, but neither of those categories actually apply as those kind of totalities. One belongs to specific creeds, which we now would call, devotional creeds, tied to either juridical thought or tied to theological thought. And so Chachnama's political theory ends up getting implemented in Delhi under Razia Sultan in the ways in which she lays out her very short-lived political rule. And so the ways in which the colonial state reads Chachnama, and the ways in which, I'm sorry to say, historians have tended to read Chachnama, is to read it through very specific binaries of faith: Muslims versus Hindus, Sunnis versus, Karamatis, and so on and so forth.
Just one other question I wanted to point out at this time. When reading your book, you reference actual conditions in Arab and pre-Arab Sindh, with some with secondary texts which come out recently and some with Arab sources. One of the secondary texts you mentioned, which you introduced me to, and it was a very exciting book, was Maclean's Religion and Society in Sindh, in Arab Sindh, which the Endowment Fund Trust will also be printing alongside this book as a separate volume to make this kind of scholarship available to people in Pakistan. So looking at that, doesn't that in a way stress the romance factor in the Chachnama itself? Because you're comparing it constantly with scholarly work of recent vintage and to Arab sources, and you show that much of its thinking is original thinking, as you would expect in a creative romance.
I think so. The issue is twofold. What the Chachnama imagines to be the 8th century and what was the 8th century are two different things in a way. So if you ask me, like, describe the 8th century in which Muhammad bin Qasim was an active political player, my evidence for that is going to be strands of textual fragments from Arab sources that themselves are at least 70 to 100 years after the fact. So we don't have any contemporary evidence at all of any sort. We have slightly later and very later. Okay. We have material evidence. We have some archaeological evidence that is dated to early 8th century or late 7th century, and arguments are being made that this is a mosque or not a mosque or whatever. But at least there is an argument of presence. Now, the argument of presence precisely does not have an exact date. That presence could be 50 years before Muhammad bin Qasim, or it could be 50 years after Muhammad bin Qasim. We're not carbon dating it to a particular year or a particular month of a particular year. So even in our material evidence, we are limited to the type of things that we can derive upon. The paucity or scarcity of evidence for the 8th century is at the bottom of a very large pile in which meta arguments are being made. Buddhists flourished in this place, then they were driven out. When they were driven out, Brahmins took over. Those Brahmins, articulated a campaign of piracy against the Muslims. The woman was captured. She cried labbaik. Hajjaj bin Yusuf heard it in Kufa. He marshaled an army. So all of this is a meta-historical argument. And the question becomes, like, was there really a woman? 100% there was a woman, but was she the woman of the Chachnama? No. Like, absolutely women were being abducted. We have evidence from now and before and always of the traffic in women. We have the evidence of communal kind of changes in patterns of living patterns of urban environments. So MacLean's text is one of the kind of best we have of marshalling different types of scarcity arguments, though he's also after the 8th century, as in that's where he's really strong, in the 9th and 10th century, when we do have a lot more material. But the question is, we're not wondering about what's happening in 712 in, I don't know, East Bengal. We're not wondering about literally what's happening in 712 in Baghdad itself. We are obsessed with what's happening in 712 in Sindh for a particular reason. And my book is about that reason, if that makes sense.
Yeah, but if you look at MacLean's arguments when he speaks about the conversion of Buddhists, he provides a intellectual platform to understand that all these conversions that the colonial historians speak of were not conversions from Brahmanism, since one of the very large religions in southern Sindh particularly was Buddhism, and then he outlines the role of the Buddhists and how they suffered in the Arab period. So I think that in a way he supports the contentions you're making. His text supports those contentions.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not saying that this text disproves it. I'm just simply saying the question of conversion itself is like, why are we figuring out who converted and who didn't convert? Like, what's behind that question? Why do we care? What happened in 8th century? Why did some person say, I'm a Buddhist and now I'm a Brahmin and now I'm a Muslim? Like, what's at stake in that? Why do we care? What does it tell us about history? And the question is, it doesn't tell us about history, it tells us about us. It tells us about the memory of this event. Conversion, you know, one of the earlier classics in conversion studies is Richard Bullitt, who retired from Columbia, who did a book on the conversion of Nishapur, a region, and he said, you know, how did they become from Zoroastrians to, you know, Muslims over a period of 30 years or so. And Bullitt, his book, I want to say, came out in early 80s, 82, 83, maybe a little earlier than that. His book, he used a kind of a social scientific or data science method. So he said, he looked at kind of biographical dictionaries, and he looked at X bin X, right? So 3 names. And he said, where do we find a non-Muslim name? Is it, you know, a generation before or 2 generations? And then he used those names and he traced them over a 50-year period. So 50 years of biographical dictionaries. How did a non-Muslim name get changed into a Muslim name? And he said, well, this is the way we can figure out from biographical dictionaries who converted or who didn't convert, or how many, or whatever other thing. And what's brilliant about the book and about the argument is, like, what a way, like, name, you know, what? Okay, but no. The brilliance of the argument is that as time moved forward, conversions became less, which is not what happens historically. Nishapur right now is not a city full of non-Muslims. So what he shows is actually the question of not converting became more politically important as Muslim rule continued, right? Completely counterintuitive. Now, again, this is on the basis of simple names, just registering names. This is not someone actually believing A versus actually believing B. This is simply how they registered their name in biographical dictionaries. So if we just take that example from Nishapur, not a space that is contested with Buddhists, various kinds of, you know, Hindu denominations and various denominations of Islam, right? We see so much complexity in trying to ascertain what conversion means or how to trace it. And that uncertainty becomes hegemonically sureties when we talk about the subcontinent, especially when we talk about Sindh. Because the fact remains that while Iran became predominantly Muslim after the invasion, the conquest of Iran, Hindustan never did, still isn't. Like, go to Iran and go to the subcontinent and tell me what happened, right? And so the question is that the question of conversion is a colonial question that we're still sticking to as if it explains anything. But what it is explaining is not what may have happened in the 8th century. It's explaining the 19th century when this question was of critical importance, and is explaining our contemporary moment when we seem to derive ourselves from the literal soldiers of Muhammad bin Qasim. I don't know, I don't want to ask for people to raise their hand, but how many people here trace their lineages to Muhammad bin Qasim's army? Any Arais? Any Maliks? Anyone? Nobody? In my yeah, in my class, I mean, I was in a high school in Lahore. In my literal class, 9th grade class, there were five who were like, we are Malik, we are Arai, our ancestry is actually Muhammad bin Qasim.
One more thing that I really try to understand this, because our whole narrative is based on this Chachnama. Even the Pakistani state refers to Muhammad bin Qasim as a first Muslim. And we have also constructed the whole idea that idea of Pakistan started from the Arab invasion. So how do you see this now, when this is not the reality and it was not really factually correct thing? So what problem do you see with this?
I mean, it's an argument that comes in and goes out and then comes in again, and then I think it's not really. I mean, Ajkal we are in, I guess, proto Riyasat Medina. I don't think we are anymore in Muhammad bin Qasim's descent, since there was a moment right at partition when 5,000 years of Pakistan was an important argument. So, Harappan, Mohenjo-daro, and Indus Valley civilization was an important argument. Then I trace in the book that's going to come out, I trace how after 1972, there was a very concerted effort to re-articulate by historians again the argument of Muhammad bin Qasim's centrality. So Muhammad bin Qasim, the Yom-e Babul Islam celebration, the Muhammad bin Qasim Endowment Trust in Hyderabad, Port Qasim that will come out. So these are all things that are happening in the 70s after 1971's partition, the creation of Bangladesh, and the claim and the demand for a Sindhu Desh. So this is the responses of kind of the state trying to manage that story. And it was very important for my generation, the generation of Ziaul Haq, we who were kind of in 7, 8, 9 group, age 6 onwards. And it's not that much anymore. So especially in Lahore, when I was doing field work for the book, nobody knew about Chachnama. I would ask people like, Chachnama, they're like, what are you talking about? It was until I went to Hyderabad and I started talking to people in Hyderabad.
And that there is a significant difference of opinion between the urban population and rural population of Pakistan. For rural Pakistan population in Sindh and Balochistan, you have mentioned that for them Muhammad bin Qasim is not hero, but in urban population Muhammad bin Qasim is a hero. This is a significant divide of opinion between the urban and rural population. So another thing that I really appreciated in your book is that since you have called it is a political advisory, and it contains, Chachnama contains 40 letters. Chach and his brother Raja Dahar and his brother Raja Dahar and Muhammad bin Qasim and Hijaz bin Yusuf. So these 40 letters is kind of a advice and wisdom, and they tells us how to deal with the difference. When Muhammad bin Qasim took over Sindh, he made Kiksa the finance minister, and then he empowered him to sign even the contracts. So this is how he dealt with governance issues, while in Pakistan we are still struggling with, even not in Pakistan, even in India, our whole politics is based on hatred. So this is a very good advice, even if we take it as just a political advisory. So it tells us a lot about this.
Yeah, I guess when I was thinking about this text as a student, I said half the battle is getting people to read it. Like if people actually read the text, they would be just like, yeah, this is not what the colonial state or the Pakistani state wants you to take away from it. Muhammad bin Qasim is doing all kinds of things that no true Muhammad bin Qasim would do, and certainly no descendant of Muhammad bin Qasim would do. He is, appointing people to high official positions that are not particular Muslims. He is giving power to a woman who he has married, who is already an older woman who was married to the deposed Raja, and he's giving her power to negotiate settlement. He is also terrible at extracting revenue from the people, and he's like, we should be, consultative. So the book itself presents a very different Muhammad bin Qasim than the Muhammad bin Qasim that the colonial state will construct, and the Muhammad bin Qasim that, my mother would say to me. This is an actual quote. I think I mentioned it in the introduction or the acknowledgements. I wanted a Jordache jeans. Anyone old enough to remember Jordache brand? I wanted a Jordache jean for my 16th birthday, and I saved for a whole year. It cost 110 rupees, and I finally had 110 rupees. And I said, Amma, can I go buy this jeans now? And I was in 9th grade. And Mama said, Muhammad bin Qasim conquered Sindh when he was turning 17, and you want to buy a pair of blue jeans. And I was like, A, yes, and B, who the F is Muhammad bin Qasim? And that was the genesis of the project, I guess.
Just one thing to increase your nightmare about the Ziaul Haq years. I think that there's a beautiful passage where V.S. Naipaul, completely enamored of this new Ziaul Haq construct, with some qualifications, goes to Bhambor. And he stands in the Grand Mosque of Bhambor and he evokes the atmosphere of what the genesis of Islam by force would have been in Sindh. And nobody bothered to consult Dr. F.A. Khan's archaeological journals because he excavated there. He found 5,000 lingams. It's initially a lingam temple, a Shiv lingam temple. And I think that that has been buried by him, so it shouldn't be destroyed by future generations.
Yeah. Before that, I want to ask him one thing. One last thing, and after that, I will ask you. Your interpretation about the Chachnama with regard to the role of women, because Chachnama portraits or demonstrates the women very wise, clever, and women are actually making the decisions. Just look at the story of Chach, and then as you mentioned a little earlier about the Muhammad bin Qasim, he is also following the advice of that old lady deposed kings. So how do you see that we in a current era still don't imagine that progressive thought that Chachnama has mentioned?
So like I mentioned, some of the things that the Chachnama advocates for only happen in Delhi under Razia Sultan. So one of the things is, if you read the text, and is that nothing that happens, and I mean the word happening like an event transpiring, that isn't a reaction to something else, that anything that's not a reaction, so any action that's a forethought, a planned thing, let's do this, rather than I have to react to something. In the Chachnama, all such active narrative decisions are made by women throughout the text. And this is remarkable, because any other text of that period of 1220s, and there are all extant, we still have them, we can consult them, does not give that centrality to women, especially political women.
Is that why Razia Sultan liked it?
And no, I'm saying that's why Razia Sultan was able to be accepted, because Juzjani makes literally that argument. He says, what is wrong with the idea of a female ruler? And this is what Iltutmish himself did. He's the one who kind of appoints his own daughter. So it is a text in which I find a incredible amount of space given to women. Women are not deviant, they're not devious, they're not prone to hysterics or, you know, create chaos. They're not the agents of chaos that often are in Arabic and Persian histories of that period and subsequently. In fact, they are incredibly astute political advisors in the Chachnama.
But not the least, we have read your two wonderful books, and we would like to know which is the third book you are working on.
So the idea was 3 books. After I finished my dissertation, I wanted to write the book that I'm now writing, and that was going to be the first book because it was a book that is about memory and history writing, and it's about what role memory has in the writing of history and archives and all these other meta historical things. So I thought I should begin with the most conceptual, biggest thing. And then I wanted to have the second book be about the world of history writing and an intellectual history of that world, which is the loss of Hindustan. And then I said, okay, finally, after doing all that tamheed and laying all that stage, I will finally be able to write about Chachnama with the seriousness that it deserves. So in order to get to Chachnama, I wanted to build first a conceptual narrative on memory and history, then an argument about history writing, and finally say, okay, Chachnama is a political theory. When I got my job at Columbia, they said, there's no way that you're writing that book first. You better write the Chachnama book. So I did that. And now I'm writing that book. I'm writing the third one.
3 quick questions from the audience. Anybody interested in asking Manan about his work? Faisal? Oh, that was just, you were just scratching your head, were you? Any questions? Sorry, please.
What does that contain? I could have asked some questions on Chachnama, but I just skipped them and come to you for that.
So the loss of Hindustan is about a historian named Muhammad Qasim Farishta, who wrote a history of a geography that he understood to be Hindustan. And this history was written in the early part of 17th century. And the loss of Hindustan is the history of that idea of Hindustan, but I trace it from basically for the whole millennium. So I go from 1000 CE all the way to 1905, 1910. And it's how that idea of Hindustan transforms and is transformed under colonial rule. That's basically the nutshell.
Last question, Mr. Asghari. Mr. Asghari, you had stood up.
I had indeed, Mr. Haroon. If I may ask, Professor, if I understood correctly.
Mic is on. Your mic is not on. No.
Lights are on.
Why don't you say it and I'll repeat it? Just say it.
Okay.
Hassan, just say it.
Okay. If I understood you correctly, Professor, the demonization of Muslims in Sindh was a colonial construct. So it was sort of 19th century to create an environment where the ruling dynasty could be deposed. Was there ever a demonization by Hindus of the Muslims in Sindh?
I wouldn't separate Muslims and Hindus as demonizing or being demonized under the colonial regime. I think the colonial regime acted on both or all communities that are in Hindustan. Were the Hindus of Sindh at some point re-articulating the idea that they have been freed from despotism of Muslim rule? Yes, they were, because they were parroting the colonial argument. The Muslims, in the sense that Muslims are parroting the colonial argument when they say that they are outsiders, that they belong to somewhere else, not Hindustan. So you know, the colonization of minds works, whether you're Hindu, Muslim, Jew, Christian, Sikh, whatever.
Stream, could you please thank the speakers?
Ladies and gentlemen, may I, on behalf of all of you, thank Professor Manan Ahmed and Asghar Soomro for an illuminating and relevant discussion. We are grateful to both of them for making the time to be with us and indeed for choosing to be at Mohatta. This evening's discussion is actually part of a series of talks, a series on subjects that Mohatta will be arranging periodically. It is our contribution, along with a number of other institutions, to raising the bar on cultural and artistic pursuit. The museum's galleries are open for viewing, and I would like to invite you all to view the exhibitions despite it being quite late and cold.
Nasreen, as a postscript, I'd like to thank Akbar Zaidi and the IBA for the phenomenal role they played in bringing Manan to the Mohatta Palace Museum so you could hear him.
Thank you, IBA. Finally, a gentle reminder that tea and snacks await you. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you so very much. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you so much.